The economic and cultural heart of the capital has officially fallen. In a terrifying display of absolute state surrender, massive, organised radical groups have completely overrun one of the largest commercial shopping centres in the country. Frightened local shoppers were literally chased out of their own community malls by aggressive mobs, while the outmatched units simply stood by and watched the occupation unfold. This unprecedented infrastructure takeover is the undeniable boiling point of a historic Britain crisis. Anyone analysing the rapid collapse of UK politics can clearly see that this is not a random, isolated uprising. It is the direct, intended result of a catastrophic government failure. The establishment has actively chosen to surrender the streets, prioritising the protection of the phantom population over the physical safety and financial survival of native taxpayers. The sheer hypocrisy of this two-tier justice system is absolutely staggering. While ordinary working-class citizens face multi-year prison sentences simply for posting dissenting tweets online, these radical, occupying forces operate with total, terrifying impunity. Simultaneously, the state has launched a devastating financial assault on the countryside, executing relentless state theft through a brutal 20% inheritance tax designed to bankrupt generational farmers. International allies are watching this systemic collapse in absolute disbelief. Global figures across the Atlantic are publicly warning that the nation is heading toward an inevitable civil conflict. Pointing to the completely unchecked migrant violence surge as the ultimate destroyer of national sovereignty. This is the stark, uncompromising reality of Britain today. The state has lost its capital, and the working class has been left entirely defenceless. The timeline of this institutional collapse unfolded with terrifying speed, exposing a nation fundamentally at war with its own foundational demographics. At exactly 30 minutes past 5 this evening, the true scale of this national unrest exploded into plain sight. Radical factions forcefully stormed the multi-storey storefronts of a premier commercial hub, immediately seizing control of the lower levels. Within 8 minutes, the privately contracted security teams completely fractured, initiating a panicked tactical retreat. Millions of pounds in commerce were instantly halted as shop owners pulled down their metal shutters in sheer terror. Furious citizens noted that the illegal immigrants London and surrounding boroughs are currently forced to accommodate were highly visible among the occupying forces, turning a beloved shopping centre into a hostile red zone. The state effectively surrendered one of its most lucrative economic engines to the mob. By 13 minutes past 6, heavily armoured regime enforcers finally attempted a delayed intervention, sparking severe, close-quarters physical clashes on the pavement. But the authorities were fundamentally overwhelmed by the staggering scale of the occupying force. Observers analysing British politics watched in absolute horror as dozens of officers initiated a secondary retreat, explicitly citing the need to prevent further casualties among their own ranks. Entire commercial sectors were surrendered without a single fight. This tactical retreat proves that the heavily sanitised breaking news UK networks deliver every evening is deliberately masking a fatal collapse of domestic authority. The police forces that eagerly kick down the doors of native citizens for controversial social media posts are completely paralysed when faced with actual, organised, radical extremism. At exactly 30 minutes past 6, furious native citizens who had been chased from the mall launched a massive counter-demonstration. Waving British flags, waves of taxpayers demanded the immediate resignation of the Prime Minister. A massive public petition for an emergency general election instantly surged into the hundreds of thousands of signatures. The working class understands that the heavily filtered London news broadcasts are desperately trying to cover up the worst leadership crisis UK history has ever witnessed. These betrayed citizens are connecting the dots. They watch the establishment burn £8 million every single day on luxury hotel contracts for undocumented arrivals, while rural farming communities are simultaneously crushed by a devastating 20% tax designed to seize their generational lands. This glaring financial and legal betrayal has pushed the public past the point of no return. By 55 minutes past 6, the national anger spilled completely out of control. A massive crowd of betrayed locals surrounded a nearby accommodation centre, furious that the state continues to prioritise the illegal arrivals, while their own community centres are lost to radical mobs. The outmatched units, who previously retreated from the shopping centre, suddenly found the courage to aggressively suppress the native taxpayers. Uncompromising opposition forces, like Reform.uk, are now loudly demanding the immediate deployment of the Royal Navy to secure the borders and initiate uncompromising mass deportations, but the paralysed establishment aggressively refuses to act. If you want the unfiltered, unvarnished truth about UK news today, you must look at the abandoned shopping centres tonight. This is the uncompromising reality of Britain News, and the definitive warning broadcast by News UK. The terrifying scenes of commercial shopping centres surrendering to radical mobs are not the result of mere incompetence. They are the deliberate outcome of a systemic, moral and financial betrayal by the establishment. Why do the outmatched units violently retreat from organised occupations, yet find limitless resources to aggressively hunt down native citizens? Because the current leadership has entirely tethered its political survival to a catastrophic open border ideology. The elite are utilising relentless state theft to force the British public to bankroll their own erasure, creating a society where the rule of law only applies to the traditional working class. The reality on the ground exposes a completely terrifying double standard that has permanently shattered public trust. We are now witnessing the state hand down devastating 2- and 3-year prison sentences to British citizens whose only crime was writing a dissenting tweet about the migrant violence surge. Meanwhile, the public sees a total absence of justice when looking at the occupying forces. Radical networks freely organise massive urban sieges and openly broadcast extreme ideologies across digital platforms with total impunity. When desperate local communities ask why there are no dawn raids against the machete gangs terrorising over 130 neighbourhoods, the regime enforcers claim they are simply too overwhelmed to act. Yet, this exact same government magically possesses the surveillance capacity to monitor the social media accounts of every working-class taxpayer in the country. This glaring hypocrisy is the defining feature of the leadership crisis UK citizens are currently enduring. This malicious two-tier justice system is inextricably linked to an unprecedented campaign of asset stripping directed at the native population. The economic reality driving this massive national unrest is mathematically grotesque. Every single day, the administration quietly drains approximately £8 million from the National Treasury to accommodate the phantom population. Endless waves of undocumented individuals bypass sovereign borders, only to be rewarded with permanent sanctuaries in luxury 3-star hotels. These facilities provide catered meals, high-speed internet, and comprehensive healthcare, entirely funded by the very taxpayers who are being chased out of their own local shopping centres. If you refuse to let the mainstream media hide the true financial and human cost of this two-tier system, subscribe to the channel right now. We are the only ones exposing the absolute ruin of the British public, so hit that subscribe button and help us fight back. To maintain this sprawling, multi-billion-pound asylum industry, the state has launched a devastating financial assault on the traditional countryside. The establishment recently introduced a punishing 20% inheritance levy, specifically targeting agricultural lands. Generations of hard-working farmers are now being forced to pay upwards of £400,000 to the government just to keep family land that barely yields a £30,000 annual profit. This is not a standard taxation policy. It is deliberate state theft. Entire rural communities face sudden confiscations, disguised as tax reform. The political elite are actively bankrupting historic family businesses to redirect that capital into the endless accommodation of illegal arrivals. Pensioners are freezing in their unheated homes to subsidise a government failure that actively despises them. Uncompromising opposition forces and the betrayed public are now loudly demanding an immediate, militarised solution to this Britain crisis. Strategies involving the direct deployment of the Royal Navy into the English Channel to actively repel unauthorised vessels are gaining massive nationwide support. The working class is demanding that Border Force agents stop functioning as a welcoming committee and start turning the boats around before they ever reach territorial waters. Furthermore, citizens are calling for relentless, 24-hour mass deportation flights to clear the massive backlog of undocumented men Yet, the paralysed establishment aggressively dismisses these survival strategies, claiming the National Treasury simply cannot afford the logistical undertaking. This excuse is deeply insulting to the voters, who watch the state burn millions of pounds a day on migrant sanctuaries. The undeniable truth of British politics today is that the government possesses the capital to secure the borders, but they fundamentally refuse to do so. They are sacrificing the financial and physical security of the native population to fund a deliberate demographic shift, and the streets are finally pushing back. The horrifying surrender of major commercial shopping centres to radical mobs is not merely a temporary friction in UK politics. It is the undeniable, chilling death rattle of a sovereign nation. If the political establishment refuses to abandon its catastrophic open border ideology and continues to prioritise the phantom population over the physical survival and financial stability of its own native taxpayers, the consequences will be completely irreversible. If you want to know exactly what this country will look like in 5 short years, you do not need to read a sanitised parliamentary report. You only need to look at the terrified, outmatched units retreating from the shattered commercial districts tonight and the generational farmers being taxed into absolute ruin tomorrow. In 5 short years, the very concept of a unified, safe British society will be permanently eradicated. The massive urban shopping centres that were overrun today will not be reclaimed by the state. Instead, they will become permanent, fortified autonomous zones operating entirely outside the jurisdiction of traditional British law enforcement. The outmatched units will explicitly refuse to enter these massive urban red zones. The historic streets of the capital will be completely unrecognisable, fractured into sectarian territories where radical mobs dictate the daily rhythm of life, and the native working class is entirely locked out of its own economy. Simultaneously, the devastating 20% inheritance tax currently being weaponised against the countryside will achieve its ultimate, sinister goal. In 5 years, independent British agriculture will be completely wiped out. The state theft, engineered by the current administration, will force tens of thousands of farming families into total bankruptcy. Once these generational lands are forcefully seized by the government, the historic Grey Belt will be violently bulldozed. In its place, the state will construct sprawling, heavily subsidised concrete cities designed specifically to house the massive influx of more than 1 million illegal arrivals.
Violent anti-immigration protests erupt across the country. A year later, and Britain is again grappling with a wave of similar fury.
The traditional British countryside will simply cease to exist, transformed into an endless staging ground for a demographic replacement that the public never voted for. To suppress the inevitable national unrest caused by this engineered destruction, the government will escalate its digital tyranny to unprecedented levels. Because the regime enforcers are absolutely paralysed by the sheer volume of the migrant violence surge, they will dedicate 100% of their remaining resources to crushing native dissent. The two-tier justice system will become the unshakable, absolute law of the land. Violent predators and radical occupying mobs will be routinely granted absolute immunity, while native taxpayers will face mandatory 5- and 10-year prison sentences for daring to criticise the government failure online. International allies have already seen the writing on the wall. Global visionaries like Elon Musk and political leaders like J.D. Vance are publicly warning the world about this catastrophic Britain crisis. They understand that a nation cannot survive when it violently disarms its own citizens, bankrupts its own food producers, and surrenders its commercial infrastructure to hostile networks. The £8 million burned every single day on luxury hotel contracts for undocumented men will rapidly multiply, utterly bankrupting the National Treasury and triggering a historic economic collapse. But the fierce uprising paralysing the capital tonight proves that the elite have fatally miscalculated the absolute breaking point of the British public. A functioning, stable democracy cannot survive when it openly despises its own foundational demographics, actively executes asset stripping against its own rural communities, and maliciously prosecutes its own citizens for posting tweets while radical mobs occupy the cities. Millions of desperate voters trusted this administration to restore order and equality. Instead, they received the most severe leadership crisis UK history has ever recorded. Anyone watching the collapse of British politics knows this societal fracture is now terminal. The elite panic spreading through Westminster tonight is entirely justified. They engineered the ruin. They executed the state theft. They arrogantly believed they could endlessly replace the population, manage the decline of the nation, and arrest anyone who noticed that the shopping centres were falling. But they will not be able to control the furious reckoning that is currently brewing. The illusion of equal justice has been entirely destroyed, and the trust in the establishment is completely dead. Millions of citizens are realising that the breaking news UK networks broadcast every evening is deliberately sanitised to mask this institutional surrender. For those desperately searching for honest London news, the reality is clear. The state has entirely forfeited its primary duty of protection. This is exactly why uncompromising opposition movements like Reform UK are gaining massive, unstoppable traction across the nation. The betrayed working class has recognised that, to survive the heavily filtered UK news today, they must completely reject the system that abandoned them to the mobs. History will judge this administration strictly by the generational farms it destroyed and the sovereign capital it willingly surrendered. This is the unvarnished truth of Britain News and the definitive warning broadcast by News UK. Stay tuned for the next update.